What if the person everyone trusted the most was the one who planned the betrayal first? This CEO never fought his pregnant wife, never accused her openly, and never created a public scandal. Instead, he quietly framed her as greedy through a will no one was ever supposed to see. And when that document finally surfaced,
Claire and I are thrilled to
the
announce
room
we're
froze
expecting our first
because the
child.
truth wasn't just shocking, it was irreversible.
We must consider the
Perfection
implications of these
attracts
recent
admiration,
developments. The
but it
situation
also
requires our
hides
full attention.
intentions no one thinks to question. Ethan Callaway stood at the peak of the American corporate world, celebrated as a man who represented discipline, intelligence, and emotional restraint. His success was not loud or flashy. It was methodical, controlled, and precise. Investors trusted him because he never appeared shaken. Employees respected him because he never appeared uncertain. To the outside world, Ethan embodied the ideal modern CEO, someone who had mastered both ambition and balance without visible sacrifice. His personal life was often presented as proof of that mastery. Business features and industry profiles subtly highlighted his marriage as evidence that his authority extended beyond boardrooms. A stable home life suggested moral grounding, emotional maturity, and reliability. The idea that a man could lead a powerful company while maintaining a composed marriage strengthened public confidence in him. Ethan understood this connection well and never discouraged it. Claire Callaway fit perfectly into that image. She appeared calm, reserved, and elegant, always present but never intrusive. At public events, she complimented Ethan without competing for attention. Observers rarely questioned her inner world because her role seemed clear. She was the quiet confirmation that Ethan's life was in order. Over time, Claire became less of an individual in public perception and more of a symbol, reinforcing the belief that Ethan's success was complete and unquestionable. Inside the marriage, however, the atmosphere was shaped by unspoken rules rather than shared intimacy. Emotional expression was carefully managed, and difficult conversations were avoided rather than explored. Decisions followed a hierarchy that mirrored Ethan's professional life, where authority flowed in one direction and agreement was expected, not negotiated. Stability was valued above vulnerability, and calm appearances mattered more than emotional honesty. What looked like harmony from the outside was, in reality, a carefully maintained equilibrium. When Claire became pregnant, the news was welcomed publicly as another milestone in Ethan's flawless narrative. The announcement reinforced his image as a man who had achieved everything society admired. Privately, the pregnancy disrupted the order Ethan relied on. It introduced uncertainty into a life he had structured to avoid it. The future suddenly included variables that could not be scheduled, predicted, or controlled with the same precision as corporate strategy. What appeared to others as joy felt to Ethan like exposure. Pregnancy carried emotional demands, legal implications, and long-term consequences that extended beyond image management. For the first time, his personal life presented a situation where control would require more than silence and routine. The effortless authority he was accustomed to no longer felt guaranteed. Claire noticed the shift before anyone else did. The atmosphere around her grew measured rather than warm, observant rather than supportive. Conversations became careful, and concern felt procedural instead of sincere. The change was subtle, but persistent enough to create distance where closeness should have grown. What should have been a shared moment of anticipation became another aspect of life being managed. Despite these internal changes, the illusion of harmony remained intact. Public appearances continued, routines were maintained, and no visible cracks appeared in the image they projected together. Yet beneath that surface, intention quietly replaced affection. The marriage was no longer simply preserved for stability. It was being positioned for a purpose that had not yet revealed itself. Ethan's greatest strength had always been controlling perception. As uncertainty entered his private life, he relied on that strength more than ever. What no one realized was that the image of a golden marriage was no longer just something to protect. It was becoming something to use. As the pressure mounted, Ethan began shaping a version of events that would soon transform his marriage from a symbol of stability into a strategic asset, setting the stage for a narrative no one saw coming. The moment vulnerability appears, judgment follows close behind. Claire Callaway's pregnancy did not change her character. but it immediately changed how others interpreted her presence. What had once been seen as quiet composure was suddenly examined for motive. Her existence within Ethan's world became something to analyze rather than accept, as if pregnancy itself introduced an agenda no one could quite define but many felt entitled to suspect. At first, there was sympathy, though it was shallow and short-lived. Polite concern surfaced in controlled doses, quickly replaced by a more cautious tone. People began watching rather than supporting, measuring rather than understanding. Claire sensed this shift before it became obvious. Conversations grew guarded, and interest in her well-being felt conditional, as though empathy had an expiration date attached to it. As her pregnancy progressed, ordinary needs were no longer treated as natural. Rest became interpreted as privilege. Planning became labeled as preparation for leverage. Even basic caution was quietly reframed as expectation. Without anyone openly saying it, the assumption formed that Claire wanted more, needed more, or was positioning herself for something beyond care and security. The absence of accusation made the suspicion more effective, allowing it to spread without resistance. Ethan's emotional distance reinforced this reinterpretation. His calm detachment appeared disciplined to outsiders, while her silence was increasingly perceived as calculated. Where Ethan's restraint was praised as professionalism, Claire's quietness was seen as intent. The contrast shaped perception without requiring explanation. People trusted what they thought they understood, and Ethan's reputation gave their assumptions weight. Silence became the most powerful contributor to misunderstanding. Claire did not defend herself because she sensed that justification would only invite further scrutiny. Each unanswered assumption hardened into belief. In the absence of clarity, observers filled the gaps with narratives that felt logical to them, even when they had no foundation. Neutrality disappeared, replaced by conclusions no one felt responsible for forming. Pregnancy placed Claire in a position of profound imbalance. Physically, she was vulnerable, navigating a body that no longer followed predictability. Socially, she became significant in ways she had never been before. Her future mattered not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. Legal implications, inheritance assumptions, and long-term considerations hovered around her existence, transforming her from a person into a variable. What made the misjudgment especially sharp was its invisibility. No confrontation occurred. No argument broke the surface. The tension existed entirely in perception, making it impossible to challenge directly. Claire felt the weight of expectations pressing against her without ever being voiced, leaving her isolated within a room full of familiar faces. The story others told themselves about her continued evolving without her participation. Each interaction subtly reinforced the same conclusion, until her identity seemed to narrow without her consent. She was no longer seen as an individual navigating uncertainty, but as a symbol of potential disruption within a carefully controlled world. Somewhere in that silence, a definition began to take shape. It did not yet have a name, but its outline was clear enough to influence behavior. Claire could sense it forming around her, tightening with each unspoken assumption, preparing to reduce her complexity into something far simpler and far more damaging. Those with power rarely wait for truth to organize itself. Ethan Calloway had learned early in his career that perception was not a byproduct of events but a force that could be shaped long before outcomes were decided. Wealth gave him reach, influence gave him credibility, and together they allowed him to control how stories formed around him. He did not need to deny reality if he could define it first. Information in Ethan's world was never freely exchanged. It was filtered, timed, and framed to produce a specific effect. What people knew about his personal life came from what was allowed to surface, not from what actually existed beneath it. Details were released in fragments, enough to appear transparent but never enough to invite scrutiny. This approach had served him well in business, and he applied it with the same precision to his marriage. Rather than addressing growing tension directly, Ethan allowed impressions to develop indirectly. He understood that suggestion was more effective than accusation. A raised concern here, a carefully placed remark there, and the rest would be completed by assumption. By avoiding direct statements, He preserved plausible innocence while allowing others to reach conclusions on their own. It was a cleaner method, one that required no confrontation and left no fingerprints. Silence became his most effective strategy. He neither defended nor explained, allowing gaps in information to widen. In those gaps, narratives formed naturally, shaped by bias, hierarchy, and loyalty. People trusted Ethan's restraint because it matched the image they already believed in. His quiet confidence contrasted sharply with the uncertainty surrounding Claire, subtly guiding perception without a single explicit claim. As this approach continued, implication replaced accusation entirely. No one said Claire was demanding, but her actions were discussed as if they required interpretation. No one claimed she had expectations, but her presence began to feel conditional in the minds of observers. The absence of clarity made the narrative flexible, able to adapt to any new detail without breaking. What made the process especially effective was timing. Ethan ensured that impressions formed before facts could interfere. Once people accepted a framework for understanding events, evidence became secondary. New information was evaluated through the lens that already existed, reinforcing belief rather than challenging it. The narrative no longer needed maintenance. It sustained itself. Power amplified this effect. Ethan's position discouraged doubt and rewarded alignment. Few people questioned a story that benefited from his authority, and fewer still wanted to disrupt a narrative that felt orderly and familiar. The imbalance ensured that even neutral observers leaned toward his version of events, simply because it required less resistance. By the time reality began pressing against the edges of the story, the structure was already in place. Perception had settled into something solid, difficult to dislodge. Ethan had not lied outright, yet truth had been reshaped through omission and emphasis. The narrative stood ready, prepared to define whatever came next. The groundwork was complete, and the label was ready. Once a word defines you, every action becomes evidence. The shift did not happen through a single accusation or public confrontation. It emerged quietly, shaped by repetition and reinforced by silence. What began as concern around Claire Calloway's pregnancy slowly transformed into a distorted narrative that reduced her complexity to one damaging assumption. The earliest reinterpretations were subtle. Decisions that had once appeared reasonable were now viewed through a suspicious lens. Precaution became excess. Planning became positioning. Even restraint was reimagined as calculation. The change was not rooted in new behavior but in a new appetite for explanation. People began searching for motive where none had previously been required, and in doing so they found justification for judgment. Neutral behavior suffered the most. Claire's attempts to remain composed were no longer seen as dignity but as strategy. Her quiet presence, once admired for its grace, was now examined for hidden intent. The absence of emotional display, which had always been expected of her, was suddenly framed as evidence of something withheld. In this environment, neutrality did not protect her, condemned her. The power of repetition accelerated the transformation. Small comments echoed across conversations, gaining strength through familiarity rather than truth. No one felt responsible for the label forming because no one had explicitly created it. It simply appeared to exist, as though it had always been there. Over time, assumption began to feel indistinguishable from fact. What made the label so effective was its simplicity. Greed required no explanation. It offered a convenient answer to every unanswered question and every discomfort people felt but could not articulate. Once applied, it eliminated the need for nuance. Claire was no longer a person navigating uncertainty. She became a concept, defined by a single word that absorbed all context around her. Ethan's continued restraint lent credibility to the shift. His silence was interpreted as patience, his detachment as maturity. In contrast, Claire's vulnerability became a liability. The imbalance of perception grew sharper, creating a narrative where one person appeared controlled and reasonable while the other seemed increasingly demanding without ever asking for anything publicly. As the label settled, Claire's identity narrowed in the minds of others. Her history, her consistency, and her character faded behind the accusation that now defined her. Every action reinforced the same conclusion, not because it deserved to, but because the framework had already been accepted. Once people believe they understand someone, they stop listening for anything that contradicts that belief. What was most unsettling was how quickly the shift felt permanent. There was no moment to challenge it, no clear statement to refute. The label did not need defense because it no longer felt like an opinion. It felt like a truth people had always known but only just acknowledged. That single word began shaping decisions behind closed doors, influencing judgments that extended far beyond perception. And as it settled into place, it prepared the ground for actions that would soon feel not only justified, but necessary, in the minds of those who no longer questioned its origin. Cruelty feels different when it is planned. What appeared to many as emotional distance or marital strain was, in reality, a calculated sequence of decisions driven by preservation rather than impulse. Ethan Callaway did not react to pressure the way most people did. He anticipated it. Every move he made during this period reflected a mindset focused on minimizing future risk rather than addressing present reality. Ethan's actions were never fueled by anger or resentment. They were preventative, shaped by the belief that control must be secured before circumstances demanded it. The growing scrutiny around his marriage and Claire's pregnancy did not unsettle him emotionally. It alerted him strategically. He understood that uncertainty, if left unmanaged, could evolve into exposure. From that moment, his priorities shifted away from partnership and toward insulation. Legal positioning became more important to him than truth itself. He began evaluating situations not based on fairness or intention, but on how they might be interpreted later. Every decision was filtered through potential outcomes, documents, and precedents. What mattered was not what was happening, but how it could be framed if challenged. In this mindset, morality became secondary to defensibility. Reputation management guided every move. Ethan's public image was his most valuable asset, carefully built over years and capable of protecting him even in ambiguous situations. He believed that as long as his reputation remained intact, any narrative would naturally lean in his favor. This belief allowed him to justify actions that quietly undermined Claire's position without appearing openly hostile. As this strategy evolved, Claire's credibility became expendable. Ethan did not need to attack her directly. He only needed to ensure that doubt surrounded her. Once uncertainty existed, her voice would carry less weight, her intentions would be questioned, and her reactions would be scrutinized. In contrast, his restraint would continue to be interpreted as strength. The imbalance served his purpose without requiring confrontation. What made the strategy especially effective was its patience. Ethan understood that immediate results were unnecessary. Gradual erosion would achieve far more than sudden disruption. Each small decision reinforced the same trajectory, narrowing Claire's perceived reliability while preserving his own image. The process was slow enough to avoid attention and deliberate enough to remain reversible if needed. The cruelty of the strategy lay not in its visibility, but in its indifference. Claire's emotional reality did not factor into Ethan's calculations. Her vulnerability, amplified by pregnancy, was viewed not as something to protect but as a variable to manage. The human cost was irrelevant compared to the structural security he believed he was building. As the groundwork solidified, Ethan's confidence grew. He believed he had accounted for every scenario, anticipated every reaction, and insulated himself from every possible consequence. The narrative surrounding Claire was no longer accidental. It was functional, serving a purpose that extended beyond the present moment. Yet even with all his preparation, one critical assumption remained untested. In focusing so heavily on protection, Ethan overlooked the possibility that control itself could expose him. And while he believed the most difficult part was behind him, the most damaging step was still ahead, waiting for the moment when preparation would turn into execution. Isolation weakens the body but sharpens the mind. Claire did not lose her support system all at once. It faded quietly, piece by piece, until absence became the loudest presence in her life. Invitations stopped arriving without explanation. Check-ins became polite rather than sincere. People who once lingered in conversation now kept interactions brief, as if proximity itself carried risk. Nothing dramatic occurred, yet the withdrawal was unmistakable. The silence around her felt intentional, though no one claimed responsibility for it. Ethan's world continued moving at its usual pace, structured and efficient, leaving little space for concern that did not serve a clear purpose. Claire sensed that her presence had become inconvenient, not because she demanded attention, but because she reminded others of something unresolved. In that environment, distance felt safer than understanding. Isolation forced Claire inward. Without the noise of reassurance or distraction, her awareness sharpened. She began noticing details that once blended into routine. The timing of conversations, the careful wording of concern, the way information seemed to travel faster without her involvement. Patterns emerged where randomness had once seemed plausible. What others dismissed as coincidence began to feel deliberate to her. The absence of voices defending her made space for observation. Claire noticed how Ethan's silence was never questioned, while hers was quietly interpreted. She saw how restraint was praised when it came from him but framed as calculation when it came from her. The contrast revealed an imbalance that could not be explained by circumstance alone. It was structural, reinforced by power and expectation. Isolation also removed the illusion of neutrality. Claire realized that standing still was no longer an option. Remaining quiet did not preserve her position. It allowed others to define it for her. Each day without engagement reinforced assumptions she had never agreed to. The more she was excluded, the more the narrative solidified without her voice. Yet clarity came with discomfort. Pregnancy already demanded physical and emotional adjustment, and isolation magnified every uncertainty. There were moments when fatigue blurred judgment and doubt crept in. But even then, something within her remained alert. The silence around her felt curated, not accidental, and that realization refused to fade. Claire began tracing the edges of what was being said and, more importantly, what was not. She recognized how certain details were emphasized while others were omitted entirely. The absence of explanation followed a consistent pattern, one that pointed away from misunderstanding and toward intention. What had once felt like personal distance now appeared strategic. In this quiet, Claire understood something fundamental. Isolation was not meant to punish her emotionally. It was designed to weaken her credibility. Without witnesses to her reality, without shared context, her perspective could be dismissed more easily. Silence, she realized, was not emptiness. It was structure. As her awareness deepened, fear gave way to focus. The environment around her had become hostile in its calmness, and she could no longer afford to assume neutrality from those who benefited from her silence. Something was unfolding beyond perception, moving toward a conclusion she had not yet seen but could sense approaching. In that stillness, Claire noticed a detail that did not belong, a discrepancy too precise to ignore. It hinted at preparation rather than reaction, suggesting that events were not merely unfolding, but being guided. And in that moment of realization, she understood she was standing at the edge of something far larger than misjudgment, something carefully built and nearly ready to surface. Some documents are written for after the damage is done. The existence of the will was not widely known, nor was it meant to be. It was created quietly, stored carefully, and designed to surface only when circumstances made it unavoidable. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard precaution taken by a man of means, but its structure revealed something far more deliberate. This was not a document shaped by care or sentiment. It was shaped by control. Every section of the will reflected Ethan Callaway's need to manage outcomes long after decisions could no longer be challenged. The language was precise, restrained, and calculated, leaving little room for interpretation. Nothing was left ambiguous, yet the clarity itself felt unsettling. Rather than offering reassurance, the document imposed boundaries. It did not express trust in the people it addressed. It anticipated conflict and neutralized it in advance. Protection within the will was uneven, revealing priorities that contradicted the image Ethan presented publicly. Certain interests were secured with meticulous detail, while others were limited through conditions that felt intentionally restrictive. What appeared balanced at first glance revealed imbalance upon closer examination. Safeguards were placed where control needed reinforcement, not where vulnerability required care. The clauses concerning Claire were particularly revealing. They were framed as reasonable, even generous to an uninformed reader, yet they operated within narrow parameters. Access, authority, and flexibility were all carefully constrained. Rather than empowering her, the provisions positioned her within a structure that minimized autonomy while preserving the appearance of fairness. The design was subtle enough to avoid suspicion but firm enough to prevent challenge. What made the will especially unsettling was how sharply it contradicted the public narrative Ethan had allowed to form. The same man celebrated for stability and integrity had quietly prepared for fracture and dispute. The foresight embedded in the document suggested anticipation of events no one else believed were possible. It was as though Ethan had been planning for a version of reality he refused to acknowledge openly. The will did not read like an act of responsibility. It read like an extension of strategy. Each clause felt less like protection and more like positioning, ensuring that control remained intact regardless of how circumstances evolved. The document assumed mistrust as a baseline and treated emotional bonds as liabilities rather than relationships. As the implications became clearer, the will reframed everything that had come before it. Decisions that once seemed reactive now appeared preparatory. Silence took on new meaning. Distance no longer felt incidental. The document connected patterns that had previously felt disjointed, revealing intent beneath restraint. What had once been dismissed as caution now appeared calculated. The will was not a response to uncertainty. It was evidence that uncertainty had been expected all along. It confirmed that the narrative shaping Claire's perception was not accidental, but supported by legal structure designed to hold it in place. The document did more than outline assets and responsibilities. It exposed intentions Ethan had never admitted, even to himself. In its language, his priorities stood unmasked, and the careful balance between image and control collapsed into something unmistakably deliberate. Patterns expose what words conceal. For a long time, Ethan Callaway's reputation had relied on consistency, but consistency itself can become suspicious when it begins to feel rehearsed. Subtle inconsistencies started to surface, not dramatic enough to cause alarm, yet persistent enough to invite quiet attention. Observers who once accepted his restraint as discipline began noticing how carefully timed it was, how predictably it appeared whenever questions edged too close to discomfort. The shift did not begin with accusations. It began with hesitation. People started pausing before repeating the narrative they had once accepted without thought. Ethan's calm responses, once reassuring, began to feel selective. His silence no longer appeared neutral. It felt curated. The same composure that had built his authority now raised questions about what it was protecting. As these inconsistencies accumulated, sympathy subtly shifted. Claire, once dismissed through assumption, became the subject of reconsideration. Observers revisited earlier moments, replaying interactions with new awareness. What had once been interpreted as expectation now looked more like restraint. What had been labeled excess began to resemble caution. The narrative did not reverse overnight, but its certainty weakened. Ethan's restraint, in contrast, began to feel calculated rather than natural. His refusal to clarify, explain, or engage no longer read as professionalism. It suggested confidence that explanation was unnecessary, that the structure surrounding him would absorb doubt on his behalf. This confidence unsettled those who had believed in transparency as a marker of integrity. The imbalance became harder to ignore. Ethan remained insulated by authority, while Claire carried the weight of suspicion without defense. The contrast no longer felt incidental, felt intentional. People began asking not what Claire had done, but why Ethan seemed so prepared for misunderstanding. The question lingered quietly, gaining presence through repetition rather than volume. Patterns continued to emerge, linking behavior across time rather than isolating it to the present. Silence appeared whenever accountability approached. Distance followed moments that might have invited empathy. Each instance alone was unremarkable, but together they formed a structure that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The image of effortless control started to fracture under its own precision. As trust wavered, attention shifted toward the mechanisms that supported Ethan's authority. Observers became curious about how his version of events remained intact despite mounting uncertainty. The answer seemed less emotional and more procedural. This curiosity did not accuse him outright, but it eroded the assumption that everything was as simple as it appeared. What unsettled people most was how prepared Ethan seemed. His calm no longer suggested innocence. It suggested anticipation. The question was no longer whether cracks existed, but how long they had been concealed. The untouchable image had not shattered, but it had thinned enough to reveal structure beneath the surface. As scrutiny deepened, focus turned toward the one element that had not been fully examined. The legal framework that surrounded Ethan's decisions began attracting attention, not as a safeguard, but as a clue. And with that shift in focus, the will itself moved from background detail to central evidence, waiting to be understood. Arrogance assumes control will last forever. Ethan Callaway had built his strategy on timing, believing that preparation mattered more than circumstance. He assumed events would unfold in an orderly sequence, one that favored those who planned ahead and understood leverage. What he failed to consider was how timing, when disrupted, could unravel even the most carefully constructed narrative. The first disruption came quietly. Information that was meant to remain dormant began surfacing earlier than expected, not through exposure or confrontation, but through alignment. Pieces that were supposed to exist separately began appearing together in conversations, documents, and recollections. What Ethan believed would stay compartmentalized started forming connections, and those connections shifted how people understood the past. The sequence mattered more than the content. Details that seemed harmless on their own became revealing when encountered in the wrong order. Observers began seeing cause before effect, intention before explanation. The narrative Ethan had relied on required a specific progression to remain convincing. Once that order broke, its coherence weakened. Questions that had never been asked suddenly felt necessary. Information surfaced without coordination, emerging from places Ethan did not control. Memories were reinterpreted. Decisions were revisited. Silence that once appeared disciplined now seemed evasive when viewed alongside new context. The absence of explanation no longer preserved authority. It magnified uncertainty. Each new detail shortened the distance between doubt and conclusion. Assumptions began collapsing under the weight of inconsistency. People who had accepted Ethan's version of events found it harder to reconcile with the emerging pattern. The belief that he was merely cautious no longer aligned with evidence of anticipation. Preparation looked less like responsibility and more like expectation of conflict. The distinction changed everything. What Ethan never anticipated was how quickly perception could pivot once momentum shifted. Authority that had protected him now amplified scrutiny. His reputation no longer absorbed questions. It attracted them. The same influence that once shaped understanding now accelerated reevaluation. Control did not disappear slowly. It weakened abruptly, destabilized by timing rather than opposition. The narrative surrounding Claire transformed in response. Actions previously dismissed as suspect gained clarity. Her restraint appeared less strategic and more self-preserving. The imbalance that once favored Ethan now worked against him, reframing silence as avoidance rather than professionalism. The structure he relied on began resisting him, reshaping intent instead of reinforcing it. Ethan attempted to maintain composure, trusting that stability would return if he remained consistent. But consistency without credibility felt hollow. Each moment of restraint was now measured against what had surfaced too soon, too clearly. The gap between preparation and reality widened, exposing the limits of control when events refused to wait. What unsettled observers most was the realization that nothing new had been created. No revelation introduced unfamiliar facts. The disruption came entirely from timing, from information appearing before the narrative was ready to receive it. That misalignment stripped the story of its protection, leaving it vulnerable to interpretation it could no longer guide. By the time Ethan recognized the shift, momentum had already moved beyond him. The sequence could not be corrected. Context could not be reclaimed. Exposure did not announce itself with spectacle or confrontation. It arrived quietly, without warning, and once it did, there was no longer any place left for the narrative to hide. Truth does not argue, it paralyzes. The moment the will entered the conversation, the atmosphere shifted in a way no one could ignore. What had once been abstract suspicion suddenly gained structure, and with structure came clarity. The document did not arrive as an accusation or a defense. It arrived as evidence, indifferent to emotion and immune to interpretation. As its contents became known, the narrative that had surrounded Ethan Callaway began to fracture. The will reframed everything people thought they understood. Decisions that once seemed cautious now appeared calculated. Silence that had been praised as restraint revealed itself as preparation. The document connected past behavior to future intention, collapsing the distance between perception and reality. For the first time, Claire's actions gained context. What had been dismissed as expectation or excess now aligned with foresight. Provisions that once felt restrictive revealed why she had acted with restraint. Her choices were no longer isolated moments open to judgment. They were responses to a structure that had already been built around her. The will did not portray her as demanding. It portrayed her as navigating limits imposed long before she was aware of them. The room did not react with shock in the conventional sense. There were no raised voices or visible confrontations. Instead, there was stillness, the kind that follows understanding rather than surprise. People revisited earlier conclusions in silence, recognizing how easily they had accepted a simplified narrative. Accusations that once felt reasonable now lacked foundation. They had been built on assumption, not evidence. Ethan's position weakened without anyone needing to challenge it directly. The will spoke where he did not, and its language contradicted the image he had relied on. It revealed anticipation of conflict where none had been acknowledged publicly. That anticipation alone altered how his past restraint was interpreted. Preparation no longer looked responsible. It looked self-serving. What unsettled observers most was not what the will contained, but how clearly it aligned with patterns they had begun to notice. The document did not introduce new suspicion, confirmed existing doubt. Its existence explained the careful distance, the selective silence, and the uneven protection that had defined recent events. The pieces fit too well to dismiss. As understanding settled, credibility shifted quietly. Claire was no longer seen as the source of instability. The structure surrounding her told a different story, one where her behavior was shaped by constraint rather than greed. The accusations that had once defined her identity lost their weight, unable to withstand context. Ethan's authority, once reinforced by silence, now worked against him. His lack of explanation felt deliberate in a way that no longer inspired trust. The room did not need resolution. It needed acknowledgement, and the will provided it without commentary. The truth stood on its own, leaving no space for rebuttal. The realization spread without direction, altering perception more effectively than confrontation ever could. Blame did not explode outward. It migrated, settling where intention was most clearly revealed. And as the implications of the document took hold, one thing became certain. The narrative had shifted beyond repair, and responsibility would no longer rest where it once had. Protection is often misunderstood by those who never needed it. Once the assumptions surrounding Claire began to crack, her actions were no longer viewed in isolation. They started to form a pattern that told a very different story, one rooted not in desire for excess, but in awareness of vulnerability. What had been labeled as greed unraveled into something far more deliberate and far more human. Claire's choices, when revisited with context, reflected foresight rather than appetite. Each decision aligned with an understanding that her position was unstable and that security could not be assumed. Pregnancy had intensified this awareness, not because it gave her leverage, but because it exposed how little control she truly had. Planning, in that light, was not ambition. It was preparation against uncertainty. Security, not excess, guided her behavior. The safeguards she sought were not about accumulation or advantage. They were about predictability in a situation designed to deny it. Claire understood that stability was not something freely offered in Ethan's world. It had to be anticipated and defended quietly. What others mistook for demand was, in reality, an attempt to prevent future vulnerability. As the narrative shifted, the contrast between perception and reality became unavoidable. Claire had not acted out of entitlement. She had acted with restraint in an environment that rewarded silence and punished openness. The boundaries she respected were never acknowledged, while the caution she exercised was recast as expectation. Once this imbalance was recognized, the earlier accusations felt not only unfair, but careless. The inversion of the narrative did not require dramatic defense. It happened through alignment. Claire's behavior finally made sense when viewed alongside the structures that limited her. The will, the silence, and the pattern of isolation reframed her actions as responses rather than initiations. She was not shaping outcomes for gain. She was navigating constraints designed without her consent. What had once been called greed now appeared as a refusal to remain unprotected. The shift unsettled those who had accepted the earlier narrative without question. It forced recognition of how easily assumptions had replaced understanding. The simplicity of the accusation collapsed under the weight of context, revealing how convenient it had been to misunderstand her. Public perception began adjusting accordingly. Sympathy did not surge dramatically, but it settled steadily. Claire was no longer reduced to a single word. Her complexity reemerged, and with it came discomfort for those who had judged too quickly. The narrative that once worked against her now resisted correction, exposing how deeply it had shaped opinion. This reversal carried consequences beyond reputation. It altered how responsibility was distributed and how credibility was assigned. Claire's restraint gained legitimacy, while the framework that had encouraged suspicion came under scrutiny. The question was no longer why she acted as she did, but why her caution had been so readily condemned. As understanding spread, it became clear that the story had never been about greed at all. It had been about control, and about who was allowed to protect themselves without consequence. With that realization, public opinion did not merely soften. It shifted direction, quietly but decisively, leaving the old narrative without the support it once relied on. Lies collapse under their own maintenance. Ethan Callaway had built his authority on restraint, believing silence would preserve control when scrutiny intensified. For years, that approach had worked. Silence created space for assumptions favorable to him, and his reputation filled that space with credibility. But once the narrative shifted, the same silence became an absence that demanded explanation. As questions multiplied, Ethan's refusal to address them no longer felt disciplined, felt evasive. The calm that once reassured investors and peers now suggested calculation. People began noticing how consistently he withheld clarity at moments when transparency would have resolved doubt. What had been interpreted as professionalism started to resemble avoidance, and the difference mattered. Credibility eroded gradually, then all at once. Each unanswered question weakened the foundation that had protected him. Observers revisited past moments with new perspective, recognizing how often silence had replaced accountability. The consistency that once defined Ethan's image now worked against him, revealing a pattern of control rather than confidence. Trust, once assumed, required justification he no longer provided. The erosion was not driven by a single revelation but by accumulation. Small inconsistencies aligned into a broader understanding that Ethan's narrative required constant maintenance to survive. The effort to preserve it became visible, and visibility stripped it of effectiveness. When a story needs protection, it exposes its own fragility. As credibility declined, control disappeared. Ethan's influence over interpretation weakened, leaving him reactive rather than prepared. The same structures that once amplified his authority now magnified doubt. Silence no longer directed perception. It surrendered it. Without the ability to guide understanding, Ethan found himself subject to interpretations he could no longer shape. The imbalance between image and reality widened. Actions that once felt insulated by status now invited scrutiny. Decisions that relied on unquestioned trust began to demand explanation. Control had not been taken from him. It had dissolved under the weight of its own contradictions. The narrative he maintained could not withstand sustained attention. What unsettled observers most was how avoidable the collapse seemed. Transparency at critical moments might have preserved credibility, but transparency would have required relinquishing control. Ethan chose maintenance over truth, and maintenance required constant reinforcement. When that reinforcement failed, the structure collapsed inward. The consequences extended beyond reputation. Relationships recalibrated. Alliances cooled. The certainty that once surrounded Ethan evaporated, replaced by cautious distance. Authority that had depended on belief found itself unsupported when belief shifted. The loss was not dramatic, but it was decisive. In the aftermath, Ethan faced a reality he had not prepared for. Silence offered no refuge when it no longer commanded trust. The story that had once protected him now resisted him, reshaping his image without permission. What remained was not scandal but clarity, an understanding of how control, once exposed, cannot be reclaimed. With credibility gone and influence diminished, Ethan was left with one consideration he could not reframe or delay. Only legacy remained, and it would be defined not by what he had built, but by how carefully he had tried to conceal it. Control decides how power is remembered. In the end, justice did not arrive with confrontation or spectacle. It arrived quietly, through recognition rather than punishment, through understanding rather than force. The shift was subtle but irreversible, settling into place as people accepted a truth that no longer needed defense. What mattered most was not what Ethan Callaway faced publicly, but how his influence faded once belief in his narrative dissolved. Justice took shape without drama because it no longer required it. The facts had aligned, the context had settled, and the story had corrected itself. Decisions once questioned found their explanations, and accusations once repeated lost their authority. There was no need for retaliation or correction from the outside. The recalibration happened internally, within the collective understanding of those who had once admired control over clarity. Ethan's legacy transformed as quietly as his reputation had once risen. What had been celebrated as discipline and foresight was now remembered as rigidity. The strategies that once impressed observers became cautionary examples of how preparation can cross into manipulation. His achievements did not disappear, but they were reinterpreted, framed by the costs imposed on others to sustain them. Legacy, it turned out, was not erased by truth. It was reshaped by it. Claire's role in that legacy remained understated but significant. She did not seek vindication or recognition. Her story settled into place as evidence of endurance rather than triumph. The absence of spectacle preserved her dignity, allowing her experience to stand on its own without amplification. In doing so, it reinforced the quiet justice that had emerged, one grounded in understanding rather than reversal. The price of control became clearer with distance. Control had demanded constant maintenance, silence, and anticipation. It had required narrowing relationships into functions and reducing people into variables. When truth emerged, it did not clash with control directly. It simply outlasted it. The structures built to preserve authority could not survive sustained attention, and once attention settled, the outcome was inevitable. What endured was not the narrative Ethan had designed, but the lesson it left behind. Power, when preserved through control alone, leaves little room for resilience. It becomes brittle, dependent on perception rather than substance. When perception shifts, nothing remains to support it. Truth does not need protection to persist. Control does. The final understanding carried no celebration, only clarity. Ethan's influence did not collapse into scandal. It receded into context, absorbed by a broader story that no longer centered him. The absence of drama underscored the conclusion more effectively than any confrontation could have. Justice had arrived in the form most difficult to resist: acceptance. Legacy settled where intention could no longer shape it. What Ethan tried to manage beyond his reach became the defining measure of his story. Control had promised permanence, but it delivered fragility. And while truth did not undo what had been built, it ensured that what survived would be remembered accurately, without distortion, without fear, and without the protection Ethan had once believed was absolute. This story reveals how a powerful CEO quietly framed his pregnant wife as greedy without ever raising his voice. What looks like discipline and control slowly unravels into manipulation, legal strategy, and betrayal hidden in plain sight. As a will surfaces, the truth flips everything the audience believed. This video is for viewers who enjoy psychological drama, moral conflict, and stories where power, trust, and legacy collide. Especially compelling for mature audiences who appreciate slow-burn suspense over loud drama.